The first question prompt is, does campaigning for animal welfare promote animal use? So I don't know how you want to swing this, Roger, but if you'd like, I can present a position. Maybe we flick back and forth, but to me, I think the welfare position would say that it will help the animals who need it now, and that it will eventually lead to an end to their use. I'm not necessarily saying that's my views. Is there anything specific you wanted to add in response to that, Roger? Or I can go through both sides of it and then we chat about it.
Well, it is interesting that you said that. In terms of discourse, it's often claimed that veganism and the animal rights position is kind of pie in the sky utopian in the future, whereas animal welfare kind of gets it done now. Whereas in actual fact, usually what tends to happen is that the animal welfare reforms that come in usually take years and years to achieve in the first place, and then they've got something like between 5 and 18 years to implement, and then you've got the monitoring afterwards and any sanctions afterwards. So the idea that there's a big distinction between animal rights is far off in the future, and obviously that's probably culturally true, but the idea that animal welfare does it absolutely now is not really correct in that sense. In terms of this question, I picked out 4 things, but I'll just mention them and then go back to you if you want, Jeremy, to make your statement. But I picked out cameras in slaughterhouses, controlled atmosphere stunning or killing, which I researched, I think in 2008, Meat-Free Monday, and there was a Meet the Victims event that, in terms of the claims making, turned into a complete kind of animal welfare show. So those are the things that I picked out. But you said that you had a statement, is that right?
I'm not sure of the opinions on this topic, but nothing specific statement-wise. I think perhaps it'd be helpful. I don't see anything in the chat at the moment for anyone specifically wanting to share their views. So maybe if we just go through those 4 examples and maybe break them down a little bit, that would be helpful. I mean, I think to me, it's kind of what I said in the opening. I mean, the question I would have is, are those, welfare reforms, does it make a difference for the animals? And, would these things happen anyway, because they're more profitable?
Well, in terms of slaughterhouse cameras, there was a big campaign to get them included. And in Britain, I believe that there is it's legislation now to bring them in, or at least it's kind of on the cusp. I think it's actually passed now. And the complaints that I see now is that the same groups are still sending in undercover camera people or their own cameras, and they're finding the violation of other animals' rights even in places where there are cameras. And so there's a real problem with the cameras, in the sense that in the legislation it says things like you've got to keep them maintained and all the rest of it. Then you've got to keep the footage for a period of time, and then you've got to allow inspectors, as they're called, access to the footage. But it's not really very clear about what would prompt that. I mean, obviously there's veterinary people inside houses of slaughter already. What further protection that the animals would get from cameras is very uncertain, and yet it's kind of presented as a kind of big kind of welfare win in a way. But as I said, the latest information that I could find is that there's been a lot of violations of other animals' rights in the slaughterhouses where the cameras are already situated, because before the legislation come in, quite a lot of slaughterhouses actually voluntarily put CCTV cameras in, but it doesn't seem to make much of a difference, because not only has the footage got to be seen by somebody who wants to do something about it, then they've got to go through the process of doing something about it. So, I think that's an issue where one of the planks of the argument is that if you announce things like, well, we now have cameras in slaughterhouses, it means from the public point of view, and don't forget, the public are operating within a very deeply specious culture. They're almost like say, okay, well, it's kind of job done now, and so they can kind of relax, and then they think that things are okay. And the general point about that goes back, actually, funny enough, to Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, and he was basically saying that if someone goes into a supermarket and they pick off the shelf you know, one of these nicely wrapped pieces of animal flesh, then they know there was no cruelty in that product. And the reason that they know there's no cruelty in that product is because there are animal welfare organizations like the RSPCA, HSUS, and the ISPCA, for example. And so their job is to prevent cruelty to other animals. And so the logic in people's heads is, well, if all these organizations are there to prevent cruelty to other animals, then this product can't be cruel, because otherwise it wouldn't be here. That's the kind of general context of this situation, that we're dealing with perceptions, but perceptions within a speciesist culture which has been trained and brought up and socialized as animal welfareists. So you know, that's the kind of issue there. If we move to this, we'll probably split these into two, maybe, Jeremy, but I'll just go through controlled atmosphere stunning and killing. I did some research on this. It was publicized by PETA as a kind of cruelty-free option. For example, one thing that they made a claim is that the slaughterhouse staff don't touch the birds, and so therefore they don't have all the kind of problems of being wrenched out of transportation crates, etc. What they didn't say is that the other end of it, at the farm end, that's still the same. And so you're still getting the catch teams, and you're still getting them crammed into the transport crates. Then they're still transported. And then it's at the slaughterhouse end when they're kind of lifted off with a forklift straight into what we call a gas chamber, but that's kind of like pretty kind of technically true. What tends to happen is that the oxygen is removed from them, and so they kind of suffocate to death. There are animal welfare experts, like Bernard Rowland, for example, who says that that's one of the most painful things to happen, this idea of kind of dying through not being able to breathe. It's kind of one of the most painful things. And so for that reason, he says that controlled atmosphere stunning and killing is not humane in the way that it's, you know, obviously not cruelty-free and all that kind of stuff. Then there's this issue about stunning and killing. I've seen a lot of animal advocates talk about the fact that the other animals in the gas chambers are killed by the system. I'm not quite sure about that. And in fact, there's a couple of people in the chat who'll be able to fill in the detail on this, I'm sure, because it's still the case that after they are rendered unconscious, they still need to be hoisted and have their throats cut. So I think that controlled atmosphere stunning is the issue. In the literature that I reviewed, there was a lot of confusion between those two concepts. For example, I would often find a title which was talking about controlled atmosphere killing or controlled atmosphere stunning, but the actual substantive text was the opposite of that, you know. So I think that we've got a problem there in the sense that, you know, we talked about a stunning system, so they're still being shackled after they're rendered unconscious. So there's still the same problem of them recovering from unconsciousness before they get, as it were, to the blade. So again, the welfare gains on this are very kind of few and far between. I found, just finally, an issue with turbulence. They found that even in laboratory situations, that pockets of air would develop in these gas chambers. And so consequently, they found that they need to create some form of turbulence in order to move the actual machine around to try and dissipate these pockets of air and oxygen, because they obviously wanted to completely remove oxygen from the entire chamber. If it remained and some of the birds found it, then they were still conscious at the end of the process. When they were taken out, you still had people at the other end with a knife trying to locate the ones who were still conscious compared with the ones who are not. So,
on that uplifting note, perhaps we can go to the first question.
Okay, yeah, sorry for rambling on.
do you guys, sorry, I was going to say, I know Harold wanted to speak and make a point. I was wondering if maybe he could bring that point before we go to the questions.
Okay, well, a couple of things. I'll work backwards. There's a couple of things that Roger talked about. In the stunning, whenever any organization says that gassing or controlled environment systems or any other kind of captive bolt systems are meant to kill the animal before have their throats cut, that's ridiculous. I mean, you can you can cite Temple Grandin's work on this too, in that the animal has to be semi-conscious during the bleeding process. Why? Because if not, it makes the meat, it lowers the quality of the meat by a factor of about 10. So you have to have the animal conscious and their parasympathetic nervous system operating so that when you cut their throat, the heart is still bleeding, so it pumps the blood out of their body. So that, because otherwise you end up with soft, manky meat, and that's not desirable in the market. It's like her shoot systems that Temple Grandin promoted. Well, on her end of it, she wasn't able to put that together, but the industry thought it was brilliant because what it did is it took down the stress in the animals. That was true, but what that does is it increases the quality of the meat. So it was a win-win, even though Temple never could see the other end of it. And then going back to the CCTVs, here in the United States, up until the 60s, well, basically until we had the Vietnam War on television at 6 o'clock at night, grade schools used to have field trips to slaughterhouses, believe it or not. Now, when my wife and I were in elementary school, we lived in Michigan, so we got taken to Kellogg's to see how cereal was made. And they ended taking children to slaughterhouses. Now, what does that say? It basically normalized the processing of animals culturally in a herding culture to everybody being comfortable with seeing what was going on from a very young age. What I think, in my opinion, having cameras in slaughterhouses is bringing that back. It's to desensitize people to what's going on, as clean as it may be, and as well positioned as cameras probably will be, so that people are seeing a, I don't know how to put it, but a less violent way of animals being killed and cut up. So my problem is that people that pat themselves on the back and say, well, I'm a locavore and I eat free range, I eat grass-based and so on. They'll say, these animals had a great life except for one bad day, and look at this camera footage. And I think Roger could speak to this, being a sociologist more than I can, is what will this do to our society when everybody can go online and see the process? I don't think it's going to move the moral ball forward. I think what it's going to do is the opposite, like it did here up until the 60s, of people being desensitized and normalizing the process.
Yeah, there is a problem of desensitization, actually, to that, in the sense that a lot of newer vegans, they kind of torture themselves with the kind of footage, and they watch Earthlings every week and this kind of stuff. And so, but after a while, they do notice that it's kind of, as it were, not so bad to see the stuff because they've seen it before. Going back to what you first said, Harold, I was interested when you said about if the blood stays in the carcass, to use that industry phrase, that's kind of called meat taint, isn't it? Like they talk about boar taint, don't they?
It's muted. Yes, that's what it's called. Then that's also one of the things why you can't. You've probably all heard of aged beef or aged meat, but beef in particular. Well, aging is a process unto itself, but if there's too much blood in the tissue, aging doesn't work because decomposition happens too quickly. Because that's what. How many people know of aged? You see restaurants and stores sometimes package meat saying this is aged Angus beef. Well, what that is they'll have a carcass, and the carcasses will be hanging in a cooler at about 34 to 36 degrees. And what they do is they let it hang until it starts to get a thin mold on it. And what it does is that tenderizes the mold, that biological action of decomposition is what makes the meat tender. So it's pre-digested meat. It's one way to look at it. It's pretty sick, but that's what aged beef is that it started the process, a controlled process of decomposition. And you can't have too much blood in the tissue for that to happen. Otherwise, it happens too quickly and you can't control the process.
Okay, who's next?
Yeah, Tom, not sure if you wanted to read out the first question you had there. You're muted.
Yes, that'd be helpful.
Hey, we managed to quieten you down there, Tom.
Just for a moment, Roger. So I believe we had our first question from L Gold. If you'd like to read that out yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, wait. Let me find it. I can't remember now. Is there a way that non-use, exploitation and rights advocates can use welfare reforms for some form of a platform? For example, could CCTV in slaughterhouses be used by right advocates by using this as a platform to get the footage online 24/7, for example, or any other similar issues where a welfare reform could actually be used as opposed to just kind of poo-pooed?
I could say, obviously, that runs straight into the problem that Harold identified about desensitization. I would also wonder about, you know, who, if the footage was available, who's going to watch it? I can imagine a lot of vegans would. I'm not imagining that you know, a lot of flesh consumers and dairy consumers would, in the sense that already they tend to come up to us even in the street and say, well, don't show me that because it's going to spoil my dinner. And so the idea that anyone other than vegans or animal advocates or people with a professional interest or sociologists, academics, for example, would tune into that kind of footage, I'm not quite sure where, you know, where that would come from. It's a problem in general, isn't it? Once we get slaughterhouse footage or footage from another animal use facility, then the struggle after that is getting it seen by the general public, because there are lots of sociological and psychological reasons why people will avoid that kind of footage, you know. So I think that would be a major kind of problem to it, to kind of use it in that sense. At the same time, I do see value in having images, you know, because people, you know, if people are showing images on the street, for example, there's always two kind of classic questions that people ask. One is, you know, where was that? And the other one is, when was that?